Welcome to this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have James with us, James Porfido. He is a seasoned defense attorney, former prosecutor, law professor, legal analyst, author, and we'll learn from him in this episode how the legal system really works, what rights the accused should know, and how justice can often be unequal. We will learn all this from him. Welcome to the show, James.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on, and good day to you. I look forward to our conversation.
You are welcome. Welcome to the show, James. Welcome to India in this online form. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk right now. We'll talk about lessons on justice and law. Your insight as an insider of 35 years will learn a lot about these things. But before that, let's learn a bit about your journey, your background, James, so that people know who they are listening to.
Sure. So I started out after law school. I had a judicial clerkship where you basically interned for a judge. And I was in the family part where I learned a lot about juvenile delinquency, which is juveniles charged with criminal acts and also domestic violence. And through that, I had an interest in working in the prosecutor's office. I worked in the Morris County Prosecutor's Office for about 8 years. I was the head of vehicular homicide, which is traditionally was death by auto, sex crimes and child abuse. I was the head of those units. And I left there and became a defense attorney. And that's what I kind of share in my book is my experiences on both sides of counsel table, going from being a prosecutor to becoming a defense attorney. And really that journey over 35 years in my career in law. And there was a lot of detours along the way, a lot of different things I did. I represented crime victims in a number of very serious cases and became involved in a foundation speaking to high school students about the dangers of drinking and driving and drug and alcohol awareness. And I spoke to about 75,000 high school students over a period of about 2 years. And that was the result of the case that I talk about in the book, which ultimately led to me leaving the prosecutor's office involving a vehicular homicide and my connection to the husband whose wife was killed. And ultimately, he was able to change the laws in the state of New Jersey regarding vehicular fatalities or homicides. And now the mandatory sentencing, if you drive drunk or recklessly and kill someone, you face a mandatory minimum sentence of 3 years in state prison. And that was not the law that existed at that time when his wife was killed by a drunk driver. And then he started a foundation. After changing the laws, he started a foundation to speak to high school students about the dangers of drinking and driving and relating to them his experience in the case. And tragically, he himself was killed by a car. He was hit jogging by the site where his wife was killed. And I ended up leaving the prosecutor's office, taking his place on the foundation board and becoming a public speaker, doing what he was doing.
Absolutely, James. So we will learn from your journey itself. We'll also come to the book. But first, let me understand about justice. So when you were a student and when you were studying law, what was your idea of the legal system that you had in your country? And what was your idea of justice at that point in time? And was it the same when you entered the profession? Or was it way different than that?
Well, it's a great question because, when you go into law school, you really don't know what exactly the law means. And that's what you're there to learn is how to think like a lawyer. I don't think that law school teaches you how to be a lawyer. I think it teaches you how to be analytical and see both sides, being able to argue from both sides of a case. And so I viewed that as an important role and responsibility. And certainly the Constitution was the guiding principle. We operate under the constitutional amendments and certainly under the constitutional regulations. And so I believed very, I think as a young attorney that, hey, this is exactly how it's supposed to be. And, as a prosecutor, I felt that way as well, that, judges were, they were your friends. They were on your side. They were there to help you and assist you in the prosecution of a case. I felt that many times. But then when I became a defense attorney, I saw things very differently, that you had to fight very hard and very aggressively and passionately for your client's rights to protect their interests. And, the principle of innocent until proven guilty, to me, was not really true. I found that was not quite the same. When you became a defense attorney, your client was guilty until you could prove they were innocent. And that's not the way the burden of proof works. There is no burden on the defense attorney. It's always on the prosecutor to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. So that kind of changed my viewpoint. And then I had to fight very hard for clients as a defense attorney, and saw things very differently.
Absolutely, James. So that is where I am trying to understand the system, the justice system, the legal system through different points in your career, because you have been a student, a prosecutor, a defense attorney, law professor, TV legal analyst, everywhere. So I want to understand if you look at it from your journey, and if you look at it from a point of your student days, what do you think, was that the legal profession or legal side or legal education should have taught you in school itself, legal while you were studying, so that you could have done better? What is it that people from the legal system can do for the students at this, in terms of legal education for students, that will hold them in good state when they come into the profession?
Well, as a professor, I teach a class called Persuasion and Advocacy. It's really the breakdown of a trial, the anatomy of a trial, dissecting a trial, from an opening statement to direct examination of witnesses, to presentation of evidence, introduction of evidence and exhibits, how to do that properly, and how to cross-examine witnesses, and ultimately how to deliver an effective closing argument or summation. And what I would tell my students is that, look, the system isn't perfect, but you have a job to do as an attorney, especially as young attorneys, to make sure that those principles that are fundamental to our Constitution and to being an attorney, that you respect those obligations and responsibilities and take it very seriously. I found that many times young attorneys or perhaps judges that were newly appointed didn't quite have that same attitude, perhaps. And it changed things. But I always told my students, you have to follow your passion, follow where your heart leads you and what you really want to do. And it may not always be to be a litigator in a courtroom. There are other avenues of law. There are many different things you can do as an attorney other than being inside of a courtroom. So, and the class is Persuasion and Advocacy. And what I would tell them is really about life, because not everybody agrees with your viewpoints on things, and you have to persuade them, and perhaps you have to advocate for your position. So it's really about life and having the ability to communicate with other people and speak to them, and maybe to convince somebody that your viewpoint is more accurate than theirs, or maybe you disagree with them, and you need to understand why they feel the way they feel, and that's important. So I think it's part of life, quite frankly. So it's an important class. A lot of takeaways from the class, not just about being a lawyer and going into a courtroom.
Absolutely. Now let's come to your prosecutor part. And that is where you spent quite a number of years, if I understand. James, as a prosecutor, and you also said that judges also try to help so that, the system is strengthened, justice, the victim gets justice because you are representing those sides, the government side, the legal system side. I want to understand then, when you looked at the cases, how does this system look, or you looked at it from a justice point of view, getting the justice for the person who is the victim or whoever it is, or is it about winning a case? Where does justice lie amidst all these things, James?
That's a great point because I talk about that in the book. It's really not about a prosecutor just getting convictions and seeking convictions. It's really about doing justice. And that really, justice means a lot of different things for different people. And, in a homicide case or a murder case, you're never going to be able to bring that person back. The family of the victim wants so much to have justice, and justice may be punishing the person that did that killed their family member to the maximum degree. That might mean justice for them, but is it truly justice? Because there is really no definition of justice that they would be satisfied with, quite frankly, in those circumstances. Then there are other cases where there are financial crimes, where money is taken from someone unlawfully, and then ultimately the victim in that case wants to be repaid. They want to be compensated. They want the money back that was taken from them. Maybe that's justice for them, is just being repaid or compensated to make them whole again. Not that taking away that experience, because the experience of having to go through the criminal justice system is difficult for anyone. Whether you're charged with a crime or you're a victim of a crime, having to be thrown into the system is very, it's foreign waters. You don't really know what you're getting yourself into. And I always looked at my role as an attorney as being an educator as well. I mean, I had to speak to my clients and make sure they understood what was happening each step of the way in the process. And I did that many times, not only, as a defense attorney, but I did it as a victim's advocate. I represented a lot of crime victims over the years. In some cases that come to mind is a mom whose son was murdered in a robbery, and she was trying to get compensation through the state to fund his funeral, just to pay for the funeral expenses. And I helped her get that money through the state, so she was able to pay for his funeral expenses. There was another case involving a young woman who had come to Seton Hall, which is where I went to college, in South Orange, New Jersey, and she was going to play basketball. And she went to a fraternity party, and she was shot and killed by someone who was initiating for a gang. And I represented the family of this young woman in the criminal justice system, just explaining to them what was happening as far as the trial proceedings regarding the killer and what would be the possible outcomes, and explaining to them what the system really is all about, because people really don't know until they're involved in it. And there were many cases like that. I represented a mom and dad whose son and daughter were killed by a drunk driver, and we had to search for justice. We had to bring the killer to justice because the prosecutor's office wasn't pursuing the case against the driver. He was clearly drunk and had killed this brother and sister. The brother was in law school himself in his first year, and the sister was graduating college to become a teacher. And he was very intoxicated. He called his sister to come and pick him up as a designated driver. And as she was driving home with her brother, she was struck by a drunk driver and killed both of them. So I fought for the parents, and we got some press, some news out there. There was an article in our paper, and it really got the attention, I think, of the sitting prosecutor, the head prosecutor, to move this case forward. And ultimately the driver was prosecuted, and he was sentenced to 5 years for each death of each child. So ultimately his sentence was 10 years. And I continue to be involved with that family, the mom and dad. Today, we still communicate with each other. So, when people ask me about the book, I say the book really wrote itself, because it was really about the people and the experiences and the cases in the book and the lives that were affected. Really, it wasn't me writing the book. I put the words on paper, but it really was the story of all the people that I was involved with over the years.
Absolutely, James. We'll come to the book after this. I just want to understand for the audience is, lot of people at different points in time listen from the legal system, from different points in time, about different sayings. Justice hurried is justice buried, justice delayed is justice denied. And justice should not be seen. Justice should not only be done, but it should also be seen to be done. And also that even if many guilty go scot free, but not one innocent should get punished by the system wrongfully. Amidst all these sayings, again, I want to understand, as a lawyer who knows about things, who have seen things from very different angles, how should a common person understand about justice? Because every day, everything seems to be happening. Justice delayed, justice denied, you know, justice hurried, justice buried, and wrong and innocents getting imprisoned, almost going to the death row. I want to understand that aspect of your understanding from a common person, for a common person who would be looking at it, the whole system, for the word called justice, James.
Well, yeah, it's a great point because, people watch television, and certainly in the United States, and there are a lot of crime shows on and justice shows, criminal justice, and, about crime dramas, and they have their own ideas about what the law really does or is. And it's not always that case at all. Like you said, justice delayed is justice denied. That's so true. And certainly I experienced that as a defense attorney many, many, many times where I was representing people who really just wanted their day in court. They were innocent. They wanted to be able to tell their story. And the process doesn't allow for you to get into court immediately. It just, there is something called a speedy trial. You have a right to a speedy trial, but I think, given whatever the circumstances are, that's kind of a moving target. It's not fixed, but if somebody's sitting in jail every day, they're sitting in jail. That's delaying their day in court. And that's certainly justice that is delayed. And I experienced that so many times, especially during the pandemic of COVID, when the court system really was kind of on it was saddled with so many cases, and the judges had a responsibility to keep the cases moving. The courts were trying to stay, operating and get these cases heard. And then it became more about numbers, moving cases and satisfying, that the higher ups, let's say the administrative office of the courts, that these cases were moving along. But people's fundamental constitutional rights were being compromised, at least from the criminal end. And I experienced that on many, many cases, and certainly many experiences that I had with clients that were sitting waiting for their day in court and ultimately, trying to litigate their cases, trying to fight for them and, try to shed some light on the fact that there were a number of issues in their case, because ultimately, the prosecutor presents the evidence. They have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But part of the process is that they have investigations to do. And if they haven't completed their investigation, they need to interview other witnesses. That's a delay. That's a delay. And I experienced that many times where they just were not ready to move their case forward. And meanwhile, you have a client that's sitting in jail waiting and waiting. And then I talk about this in the book, is it became a bit of a tactic, I'll say, a strategy where they would delay. And as a private attorney, you were being paid or compensated by the client through the retainer agreement. And they would wear you down and basically dissipate or, deplete the retainer where there was no money left. And it became very expensive for people to have their days in court. It became, almost cost prohibitive at sometimes for people because they just didn't have the money available to them to continue on in the process. And they had to pay for these unnecessary court appearances where the prosecutor wasn't ready and said, "Judge, I need more time. I haven't provided this information," or "I need to interview that person," or "There was some evidence that was collected that we haven't had analyzed yet, Judge. We're waiting for a DNA analysis on certain evidence or a fingerprint analysis." I have experienced it all where they come to court and they just ask for more time. And the judge is inclined to grant that. The judge isn't going to say, "Hey, you know what, you had enough time. This case is going to move and it's going to move tomorrow." That used to happen maybe 25, 30 years ago in the beginning of my career, but certainly not towards the end of my career at all. Having a trial became a very big event, scheduling event, getting a jury panel in there. It would take literally weeks for that to come together, for attorneys to prepare questions for the judge to ask the potential jurors, the called voir dire. In New Jersey, we were just moving in certain counties to attorneys doing voir dire. In other states, the attorneys do the voir dire questioning of potential witnesses to see if they can sit as a juror and be fair and impartial and unbiased, like a judge should be. And that's part of the voir dire process. In order to impanel a jury, you need to make sure that they can sit and evaluate the evidence and basically come to the court as a blank slate, which is nearly impossible because everybody has opinions and life experiences.
Absolutely, James. Now let's come to your book, Unequal Justice, A Search for Truth to Balance the Scales. I thought there was this saying called that everyone is equal in the eyes of law. You talk about unequal justice. Help us understand the title of your book.
Well, it was, I'll just show you, it's Lady Justice, and she's peeking out from the blindfold, and the scales of justice are not clearly balanced. So that was my idea, my concept. Before I even wrote the book, I had a vision in my mind because, Lady Justice is holding scales and she's blindfolded. But if she's peeking out from underneath the blindfold, she's got her finger on the scale and it's not really fair, right? It's not blind justice, and clearly it's unequal. So that was my experience later on, as in my defense career, that it really wasn't about equal justice. It was really about keeping somebody in jail if they were accused of a crime because it was the better thing to do. Rather than have them out on the street, it was safer to keep them in jail. And it really wasn't about them proving their case. And later on, the fact that I was talking about before is that they would stall and delay. And ultimately, if they got pushed to go to a trial, you got this kind of a sensational plea deal, plea resolution where there's a plea bargain. Instead of going to a trial, the prosecutor would present to you a plea offer, and it would be something you couldn't refuse. It would be like time served. So your client wants more than anything to get out of jail. So if they're presented with an opportunity to plead guilty to a downgraded charge or a lesser charge, and it means that they're going to be released from jail, by all means, they're going to do that. And any competent, capable defense attorney would be encouraging that client to take that deal so that they could get out of jail, because they could be waiting another 6-8 months, a year to go to trial.
Absolutely. So I want to understand for the audience, who is this book for? What have you dealt in this book? The legal system is so vast. The justice delivery system is so vast. How did you put all those things into this book?
Well, I didn't write the book as like a law book. It's not written for like lawyers. It's not written for law students to educate them. In some ways it is, because it really talks about the unfairness of the system and how the system really needs to be fixed. And I don't offer any solution as to how to fix it, other than to say that the people that are involved have responsibilities to do their jobs and be fair and be honest and have some level of integrity. But I wrote the book really to talk about the experiences that I had as an attorney, both as a prosecutor and a defense attorney, and really all the lives and the people in the cases that were affected, because there were very interesting cases that I came in contact with. I was, fortunate enough in some ways to have experienced this. As a young prosecutor, I always wanted to try cases. I wanted to go in front of a jury and tell the story of the case and present the evidence and have the jury make the decision. And, when I got convictions, I felt very good about that. Obviously, I felt that I had done my job, and as a representative of the taxpayers, of the people in the state of New Jersey, I felt like I was doing something very good. And then, as I became a defense attorney, then my responsibility was to my client to make sure that they had their day in court and that they were fairly represented and aggressively represented and passionately represented. And that was lacking from my side. I thought that many of the defense attorneys that I encountered that, I saw day to day, they didn't have that same passion that I had about fighting for people and their rights. And I viewed my clients really a lot like family. Everybody was family to me, and I could relate to them. And, they were involved in a very stressful, horrible situation if they were, being accused of a crime and they truly were professing their innocence. And I certainly respected that there was a victim involved in many of the cases. There aren't a lot of victimless crimes. So, I certainly understood that they had gone through something very significant. And, there was a balancing of that. Obviously, seeing it from both sides, you have the ability to do that.
Right. So who is this book of yours for? What is it that you want your book to achieve?
Yeah, I think it's I think there's a lot of stories in the book about particular cases, and each one of the cases is a story unto itself and a chapter in some senses in the book, which I tried to give them some interesting titles. And, I could talk about some of the cases in particular. One involved an abduction and a sexual assault of a young woman coming out of a health club. And the case was really put together through a series of all circumstantial evidence. There was no direct evidence tying this homeless man who was living in the woods behind the health club to this crime. And ultimately, we were able to establish through circumstantial evidence that he was, in fact, the perpetrator of the offense. And there were many, many things. There was a voice lineup where she was able to recognize his voice in a lineup of 5 other people, and she picked his voice out. She had detected, she did not see him because he was hooded. He had a hood over his head, and he attacked her from behind, so she could not see his face, but he had put his hand over her mouth to cover her mouth from screaming. And she smelled his hand. When his hand was over her mouth, she smelled. And she said that he had a rancid odor to his hands. Very distinct, rancid, horrible odor. She was robbed of $20, a $10 bill, a $5 bill, and 5 singles. Those were the denominations. So when this individual ultimately made himself, I'll say, a suspect through his interest in the case and what was going on outside the health club, the main detective involved asked us to smell his hand. And sure enough, he had a rancid odor to his hand. Upon him being arrested, he was searched, and he had in his pocket a $10 bill, a $5 bill, 4 singles, and he had just bought a slice of pizza for $1, and he had a dirty pizza napkin in his pocket. So, there was many ways to establish that he was, in fact, the perpetrator. And ultimately, he was sentenced. He was sentenced to 60 years in state prison, 30 years without parole. That sentence was reviewed by the appellate courts and revised, and he ultimately was sentenced to 40 years, 20 years without parole. And he was killed in prison probably about 6 or 7 months after he was sentenced. And the young woman who was the victim in that case never really truly got over the trauma of this. And she became addicted to drugs and ultimately died of a drug overdose. So the name of that chapter is The Killing of MM and Death by Prison. But there are many stories like that, many, many stories. We talked about me being on court TV and being a TV legal analyst. And that really resulted from a case where I was a prosecutor prosecuting a husband who had slit his wife's throat from ear to ear and tried to make it look like it was a robbery outside of a supermarket. And she miraculously was able to be saved. And testified in the case, and he was convicted. It was one of the quickest verdicts, quite frankly, that a jury had come back. He was found guilty within 15 minutes of attempted murder of her, and he was sentenced to 20 years, 10 years without parole in state prison in New Jersey. And I was contacted by the Geraldo Rivera show, and they were doing a piece or a story on domestic violence and those batterers that, seriously abuse or kill their spouses or loved ones. And they asked me about that case, and they said, would your client be, or would the victim in that case, let's say, would they be willing to come on the show and talk about their experience? I called her up and she said, I'm not going on the show without you sitting next to me. And that kind of was the start of because I was on the Geraldo Rivera show sitting with her. And then it just turned into a series of opportunities, like O.J. Simpson or the Menendez brothers, Michael Jackson, Scott Peterson, all of the big cases that were in the news, I was being called to speak about. And it was a great opportunity to do that. And most recently, I guess, was the Harvey Weinstein trial and the overturning of his conviction.
Absolutely. So, James, how much do you see? Is justice all about, bigger lawyers with lot of resources? Common man, does he have that chance of getting justice, or is it all unequal justice? Also, the role of media, social media in today's time. How do you see that, James?
Well, we see so many cases that get tried in the press. Really, the media covers and gives a certain slant, because I don't think the media just presents it, impartially. They don't just tell you the story. They tell you the story with an opinion. So, it automatically creates, I'll say, a decision in people's minds about a case. They're already predisposed in many ways to decide a case, and they should not be, especially if they're going to be, obviously, if they're not going to, they can't be a juror in the case if they have that opinion. But there are so many cases that are tried in the media. And you also raised a very good point about money. Justice has a cost. I truly believe that justice has a cost, and to avail yourself of very good, competent, capable attorneys, it does cost money. Now, I'm not saying that public defenders are not good lawyers. There are many, many very good and great public defenders that are competent and capable and very good and skilled trial attorneys. But if you're privately retaining a client, there is a cost associated with that justice, getting your day in court and having a trial. And it can be very expensive. And not everyone can afford that. So there is absolutely a cost to that. So that plus the media, there are many variables that come into play when someone is charged with a crime and they want their day in court.
Right. So do you think people should expect justice from the system, or they should look at having enough money to get justice for themselves from it? Only then that it's possible, or only very minute chance that the system will support you if you are a victim?
Well, people often would say, I want my day in court. My clients would say, I want my day in court. And I'd say, be careful what you wish for, because, we could be having this conversation 6 months, 8 months, a year from now and still having the same conversation. And, so getting to your point, justice delayed is justice denied, but it also has a cost associated with it that they may not be able to continue to pay you for that service that you're providing. And, I have to say that towards the end of my practice, when I closed my practice in December of 2023, I became affiliated with the firm of counsel, and that's what I'm doing now. But many times I had to make a request of the court, a motion to be relieved as counsel. What that means is that the client can't pay you any more money. They've run out of money. The system has beaten the case down. You've gone to court a number of times and there's been no forward progress. The case is not moving. It's not advancing. And, ultimately you have to say to a judge, my client cannot afford to pay me any more money, Judge. I cannot, continue to stay on in this case. I have to be relieved as the attorney. And I have to say that towards the end of my private practice, that became more and more, I would say probably at least 6 or 7 times I had to make those motions to the court and say, I've got to be relieved as their attorney because I cannot continue. I'm running a business. I have an office. I have staff. I can't afford to stay in this case and take away from the people that are paying me to represent them.
Absolutely. And very quickly, James, do you think there are changes that can be done or that should be done for true justice and fairness for especially the common man? Does it occur to your mind, or do you think that the system will continue to run the way it is?
Well, I'm optimistic. I want to believe that when we put good, competent, capable people in the positions that they're going to exercise their responsibilities seriously, and that in and of itself can dramatically change the system. Unfortunately, that's not always the case, and in the United States, many states have elections for judges and head prosecutors. In New Jersey, where my practice was and is, it's appointed through the governor. The governor appoints prosecutors and judges. So on one hand, you have a very political process, in the appointment of judges and prosecutors by a governor. And then on the other hand, you have political candidates running a campaign where they have to raise a lot of money to be elected to that position. And with that money comes strings attached. So there's going to be conflicts of interest. And so what I say is that I think that the system can be improved. I think it can be. I think there's an opportunity for it to be improved. I think talking about the problems that we experience as attorneys in the system presents itself as an opportunity to change. And I'm hopeful and optimistic that there will be changes. I mean, is it going to happen overnight? No, it's not. I don't believe that it's going to be tomorrow, that it's going to be all better. It's not that simple. I read a book not that long ago. The name of the book is Framed by John Grisham. And he wrote the book with a gentleman by the name of Jim Calhoun. And there were 5 stories from Grisham and 5 stories from Calhoun. And it was about people that were wrongfully charged, arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced. And ultimately, those convictions should have been overturned in each of those 10 cases because of evidence that was not turned over by the prosecutor. They concealed evidence, or they went to jailhouse informants and used them to testify against these individuals, and then later learned that they were lying and did not disclose that. Judges working with the prosecutor, knowing certain things about a case and the shortfalls or shortcomings of the case, but allowing it to go through. And ultimately, these people were sentenced, and many of them to very serious long terms of incarceration, and their sentences were overturned. Their convictions were overturned. And sadly, one of the individuals went to death row and was executed. And he was accused of murdering his 3 children by burning the house down with his 3 children in the house. And it was not true. He maintained his innocence. And ultimately, it was learned that the arson investigation was faulty, that the individual that testified as an expert witness had very little experience about arson. And he gave the opinion that it was an arson, and it clearly was not. It was an electrical fire. And this man was put to death. And it was a show on Netflix. I just watched it, actually, not that long ago. It was done, I think, in 2018. So, yeah, I think there's many opportunities to change, but it's really important that the people involved are willing to make the changes and recognize the problems. And that's the problem that I fundamentally see, is that sometimes the people are so involved in the system, they don't see how bad it is and how much it can be changed and how it should be changed.
Absolutely. My last question is, do you think, AI is very silently creeping into the judicial system, justice system. Do you think it will be what way it will impact? Do you think it will change the system for the better? Otherwise, people will find difficult to stay within the legal system itself. How do you see the impact of AI into legal system?
That's a great question because it really is changing the landscape in the law business. I don't know as it goes to court. I mean, you still have to have the ability to speak to people as an attorney. I think that's fundamental, is the ability to stand in front of a jury and present your case. I think AI will help in a lot of respects in terms of maybe breaking down evidence in a trial, maybe helping an attorney to develop an effective opening or closing statement. I think it's going to provide a lot of opportunities in those areas, but ultimately, when it comes down to the presence in the courtroom, you cannot change that. That can't be substituted for AI. So, trials are very different today than they were many years ago, but they're still the same in a lot of ways. So it's more difficult to get to a trial today. I think it's much more challenging to have a jury trial today than it was in the past. But AI, I think, will definitely play an important role in leading up to a trial, in the preparation for a trial, the review of evidence, and perhaps even so much as to help an attorney to prepare an opening statement and to maybe look at what an opening statement is that they're giving and maybe make some suggestions or changes that might make it more effective or presentable to convince people. So I think it will play a role in that part for sure.
Absolutely. We'll have to keep that watching for what changes come in the future. As of now, it's great talking to you, and I'm sure a lot of people would want to connect with you, learn more from you, James, learn more about everything that you do, and also about your book, learn from your book. What is the best way for them to connect with you, get your book?
Sure. There's the book is available on Amazon and barnesandnoble.com. I have a website dedicated to the book that I'm working with the publishing company with that website. It's www.unequal-justice.com. And I also have my own personal web site, which is www.porfidolaw.com, which will take you to the firm that I'm affiliated with now. But certainly I'm easy to reach. And if you search for my name, you'll find me very easily, and I'm happy to connect.
Absolutely. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Very good discussion.